All right, looks like we have enough folks to get started. Thank you all for joining today. Really looking forward to this debate and appreciate everybody's attendance. For introductions, my name is Derek Stenslick. I'm the founding partner of Telos Energy, a longtime friend and collaborator of ESIG, and I'm going to be the moderator of today's debate. So before we get started with the debate, you'll see the splash screen here. If you go to Slido and enter code ESIG16, we're going to be having a Q&A throughout this debate, and specifically going to audience questions towards the end of the last 15 minutes. So go ahead, join the Slido page, use event code ESIG16 if you want to be asking questions. So before we start today's debate, I want to thank ESIG for hosting and promoting this event. For those of you not familiar with ESIG, they are a member-based nonprofit organization providing members with objective information, resources, and networking opportunities in support of renewable energy and energy systems integration decisions. ESIG does this through workshops, tutorials, webinars, blogs, working group and task force activities, and now debates, and also produce technical resource materials. ESIG also serves in a leadership role in the Global Power System Transformation Consortium, or GPST, whose mission it is to bring together key actors to catalyze a rapid, clean energy transmission at unprecedented scope and speed. ESIG leads one of the 5 pillars, which deals with the research agenda for system operators. For more information on GPST can be found at globalpst.org. So ESIG just finished up the Forecasting and Markets Workshop in June, just last week, and is preparing for the Fall Technical Workshop in October. ESIG's workshops and monthly webinars are open to everyone. So a reminder for folks, feel free to register anytime at the ESIG website. If you're new to ESIG, I strongly encourage you to follow up if you want to hear, and I think you'll be pleasantly surprised. You can find ESIG at www.esig.energy, as well as LinkedIn, Facebook, and Twitter. So now for the logistical matters before we get started. The participant lines, you all will be muted. Myself, Kevin, and Sam will be able to speak. We will open up Q&A towards the end. So for the Q&A, again, we're going onto the Slido platform, and we're asking you to enter your questions there. That also gives participants a way to vote up the questions they are most interested in. So go to slido.com, enter ESIG16 as the event code, and you can follow the instructions there. We plan, again, to leave 20 minutes towards the end for audience moderated debate. If you have a specific question kind of throughout, I will try to be monitoring that as we go, so maybe I'll be able to get it in as we progress. And perhaps most importantly for the logistics, I do have mute buttons, so Sam and Kevin, you're warned. I don't think I'll have to be formed that out though. So with that, I will introduce the topic that we're going to be covering today slightly, and then get into the speakers. So unlike other ESIG webinars, we're mixing it up a little bit for this one. This is going to be, instead of presentations, I'll be moderating a debate on average versus marginal ELCC or capacity accreditation methods. You know, I personally think this is one of the most important questions in the industry right now. The average versus marginal ELCC, I like to call this the multi-billion-dollar question that almost nobody knows about. So I know the 250 or so folks that are on the line today probably do know about it, but I think overall in the power system, in the energy industry, it's a very nuanced question that has a lot of impact in the way we structure our energy markets and plan out our systems. And this is happening across the industry, across different ISOs, RTOs, and utilities. They're all grappling with capacity accreditation. And when I talk about capacity accreditation, that's really the process in which we determine the firm capacity contribution that resources bring to the system for reliability and resource adequacy. So when the system is tight, when we're really operating in that that period when we have short supply on the system, who's showing up during those periods? And in competitive markets, this capacity accreditation determines the quantity of capacity each resource can bring or offer into the market, and ultimately sets that market clearing price for capacity. In vertically integrated utilities, it determines which resources are procured in IRPs, and how much resources need to be built for future load growth. So the energy transition is requiring grid operators to really change the way they're thinking about accrediting resources or change the way we approach this topic. And while effective load carrying capability, or ELCC, is the metric utilized most across the industry and being adopted more broadly, the specific details of how that's done and how the calculation is made is changing, and so is the underlying resource adequacy and probabilistic analysis that underpins it. So right now, kind of across the country, we have proposals in front of FERC, we have IRPs in front of stakeholders that are really seeking the answer to tough questions around the future of capacity accreditation. So ESIG decided, because it's such an important debate, such an important topic right now, we wanted to bring in two experts, Kevin Carden and Dr. Samuel Newell, to help answer some of these questions. So Kevin Carden is the director of Astrape Consulting, an energy consulting organization with a focus on resource adequacy. Under his leadership for the past 17 years, Astrape Consulting has performed planning reserve margin studies, ELCC studies, renewable integration studies, and operational flexibility studies for utilities, regulators, and ISOs worldwide. Kevin also led the redevelopment of SERVEM, a now industry-leading resource adequacy planning tool, which is licensed by Astrape. He holds a US patent in generation reliability modeling techniques and a BS in industrial engineering from the University of Alabama. I often wonder, as another small business owner, how Kevin ever gets any sleep at night, given the volume of work they're able to put out. So kudos to him and his team. Dr. Samuel Newell leads Brettle's electricity group of over 50 consultants addressing the most challenging economic questions facing the industry, transforming to clean energy. His expertise centers on electricity, wholesale markets, market design, generation, asset valuation, integrated resource planning, and transmission planning. He frequently provides testimony and expert reports to independent system operators, FERC, state regulatory commissions, and the American Arbitration Association. And likewise, the work that Sam and his team are doing, really, I often use that as setting the bar for the work that I try to get myself to get to. So again, kudos to him and his team for that. So short reminder, go to slido.com, enter code ESIG16 for your questions. And without further ado, let's go ahead and get started. The way we're going to structure this debate, we're going to start with 7 minutes of uninterrupted comments from each speaker. We'll then go into an open Q&A where I'm going to be moderating questions across the board. And first, we'll talk a little bit about pros and cons of each ELCC approach. Then we'll discuss how we can think about accrediting all resources on the system, and then conclude with some future considerations and where we think that future accreditation is going. So for now, Kevin, we'll start with you. Go ahead and share your screen, and we'll kick it off from there.
Sounds good. Thanks for the introduction, Derek. I appreciate the opportunity to present today. For the purposes of my presentation, I'm going to assume some level of familiarity with the debate. Obviously, there's a lot of technical jargon in here. I'm going to try to make it as clear as possible, but I have to assume that everyone has at least some tertiary familiarity with the topic. And to start, I do have a confession. So this debate was my idea. I reached out to ESIG and others about setting this up because I felt like both sides of this debate have been talking past each other to some extent for the past year or longer. And we needed a forum where the merits of each side could be addressed. Ultimately, I don't think this is that forum. This is really an introduction to the topic. The conversation has to continue after today because I believe there's going to be a lot that will not be resolved today. The math can be complicated, but I'm convinced, as Derek mentioned, that the implications for both reliability and economic expansion of the generating fleet are enormous, and this deserves continued exploration. Before this debate, Sam was kind enough to engage in a number of pre-debates. Naively, I think I thought that maybe I could convince Sam of the technical flaws of marginal ELCC accreditation. Unfortunately, I realized that we have a more fundamental disagreement. This is, in my mind, an ontological debate about the nature of what capacity really is as a product. And here's the crux of the issue in my mind. I believe that any two portfolios of resources that supply the same reliability, supply the same capacity. That, by definition, is what capacity is, a product that gets me to a particular reliability level. So imagine a system with 50 gigawatts of peak load. If I start from scratch and procure all gas resources to meet 1 in 10, or if I meet 1 in 10 reliability with all solar and batteries, ultimately the composition of the portfolio is immaterial to the amount of capacity that I procured. Obviously, in the solar and battery case, I've got lots of nameplate capacity, but ultimately the effective capacity, which is what we're trying to measure with the ELCC, is going to be the same. Any two portfolios that get you to the same reliability supply the same capacity. The only way to respect this principle is through average ELCC accreditation. Marginal accreditation says that two portfolios that achieve the same reliability really could have vastly different capacity. They could supply different capacity. Now, ultimately, the composition of the portfolio does affect the price. And I'm going to try to demonstrate that I agree with the method that Sam endorses to set the price. Ultimately, I think that's immaterial to this debate. Sam will disagree, but in this, I would like to focus the conversation around thinking about the volume of capacity that we're procuring, how to perform that accreditation. All right, so I'm going to start with a simple illustration of what we're trying to accomplish with capacity accreditation. And this is generally the concept, hopefully I'm not misrepresenting, but the concept that marginal ELCC advocates have in their minds. We are buying enough capacity to meet load plus reserves during the net load peak hours. So if you look at this illustration, the net load, because we have significant solar in the system, we've shifted the time of reliability events to late in the day. So accreditation in a marginal framework is trying to ascribe capacity value to resources that get us to the load plus reserves in those critical hours. Average accreditation looks at the gross load peak. Now, this is certainly a challenge for average accreditation. Why in the world would you pay for capacity at 2 o'clock in the afternoon when I've got significant solar generation on the system? So in the marginal framework, that means that solar is effectively going to get no credit for reducing the peak. They're only going to get credit for the output during those critical hours. For some reason, I think this framing of the issue is easier for people to swallow for solar not getting paid for the reliability that they bring. But I think ultimately that storage examples better codify the philosophical issue that I have with the marginal ELCC framework. So I'm going to go ahead and jump to another example. It looks at illustration of different accreditation methods. So in California in 2030, we're expecting 50 plus gigawatts of solar capacity and 20 gigawatts of storage. I've drawn an example here for a critical day in which we've perfectly flattened the net load with batteries. Now, how much reliability value those batteries bring? They reduce the net load by 18 gigawatts. But only looking at this day, the marginal ELCC is actually 0%. 1 extra megawatt of battery can't get charged, so it can't discharge. So ultimately, batteries will not provide any incremental value. So their marginal ELCC is 0. And if we accredit that entire portfolio that reduced the net load peak by 18 gigawatts, it's going to get 0 credit. I think Sam would challenge that. How could you get to a scenario where you select 18 gigawatts of capacity? You'll never get to a system with 0% ELCC. Ultimately, I think that's a misunderstanding of how storage deployments I think may happen. Eventually, we will have long duration storage options to shift the load from the weekends to weekdays. And this means that 8-hour batteries have maybe an 8% ELCC. We're shifting from weekend to weekday. And 100-hour batteries have 100% ELCC. I'm not going to try to guess which long duration technology may be viable, but there are technologies who have a much lower cost for energy, but higher cost for capacity. So based on published claims, perhaps an iron air technology with a 100-hour duration might be twice the capital cost of an 8-hour battery. So imagine we have bids from 8-hour batteries at $100 a kilowatt year and bids from 100-hour batteries at $200 a kilowatt year. Obviously, we should select significant 8-hour batteries in this example because they're half the cost of those long duration batteries. But if I select enough 8-hour batteries and I perfectly flatten the daily net load shape, the only thing that I can do from there is to select longer duration batteries. If I select those longer duration batteries, ultimately, those 100-hour batteries are going to mean that 8-hour battery has an 8% marginal ELCC. If I select those 100-hour batteries with a bid price of $200 a kilowatt year, those 8-hour batteries that serve almost 20 gigawatts of the peak load are going to get credit for 8%. So they're going to get credit for 1.8 gigawatts of credit. Now, if I give them 8% credit at a $200 bid price, that means they get paid $16 a kilowatt year. That's just not viable. They need $100 a kilowatt year. So with economic clearing, we selected the right cost-effective resources, but this retroactive marginal ELCC, we've destroyed the auction results. Now, this is an edge case, but the principle applies for any system with energy constraints. So imagine a system with significant gas generation that has fuel constraints. We got the same issue in that, where we could have 10 gigawatts of effective capacity, but only giving credit for 0. All right, so the final slide I want to go through is an example where I think we have a solution. You do have to recognize the marginal contribution of every resource. So my proposal here is dynamic marginal clearing with average accreditation. So every resource is going to clear on the margin. And I'm going to step through this illustration here that shows that as we add this technology that has significant off-peak constraints. So we're going to shift the net load peak time from the summer to the spring because we got simultaneous maintenance outages. So with these simultaneous maintenance outages, we are creating shortfalls in the spring. We're surfacing some reliability events in the spring, but ultimately, should we not pay for the capacity that is shifting that net load from the summer to the spring? What happens with marginal accreditation is we have this jump as soon as this becomes binding. Now, all that capacity, so we had 25 gigawatts of capacity that served the load during the summer. Now, all of a sudden, the entire value of that portfolio drops to near 0. If we continue clearing, stepping up, recognizing the marginal contribution of every resource, we're ultimately going to fulfill our obligation with resources that meet the aggregate need. Okay, so final slide, just one final closing thought. If I can get one more minute, Derek.
Go ahead, one more. We'll give Sam one more as well.
Sounds good, thanks. So this method is recognizing marginal accreditation. So for every step, we're recognizing that capacity auctions are a sequential process. We're selecting the cheapest resource. We continue stepping up, selecting the cheapest resource until that resource is no longer the cheapest resource, and we continue recognizing the marginal credit. So as you add more of that resource, you're going to shift the timing of reliability events. And as we do, our selection process uses the marginal ELCC to select. Once we're done, we're left with the integration of all those marginal values. And what does that yield? Ultimately, if I recognize the marginal value of every resource that is selected, the integration of that is the average ELCC. Ultimately, all these resources are dispatched equitably. So I do believe that is fair. So they provide average ELCC toward reliability. So ultimately, I do believe there are methods that accurately capture the marginal impact of each sequential resource selection and justly and reasonably accredit those resources through average ELCC calculations. Thanks.
All right, thank you, Kevin. Appreciate that. Sam, it is over to you. We'll get your screen share up and we'll give you 8 minutes to give your side of the story.
Thank you. Can you see my screen? Can you hear me? And you can, okay, wonderful. Great to be here with all of you. This is great attendance, and we're all here because as the fleet is transforming faster than any time in our careers, and the nature of the reliability risks is shifting, we are asking the question, what is the ability of different types of resources to mitigate those risks? And the big question is how to set resource adequacy requirements and accredit resources. By the way, I think we can get almost all of our energy from clean, renewable resources. We just have to get this question right about how to deal with resource adequacy and also the operational issues having a more variable and unpredictable net load. So, and oops, hold on, just have to change slides here. Okay. So accrediting resources accurately for their contribution to resource adequacy is important for several reasons, but the most relevant to today's debate is how to get the right exchange rate among different resources. How to get the right exchange rate to support reliability neutral substitutions between when you set the requirement and accreditations and the auction. And also to signal adequate and economically efficient investment and retirement decisions. Both of those require that every accredited megawatt provides the same value on the margin. Now, effective load carrying capability expresses a resource's contribution to reliability to the resource adequacy objective. And it's expressed as a percent of nameplate capacity relative to that of a perfect resource. And it's calculated using simulations similar to those used to set the resource adequacy requirement itself. Now, marginal ELCC is obviously the marginal value of any resource in a given fleet. And what's interesting is that as you change the fleet by relying on more and more on a particular resource type, the diminishing marginal returns, the marginal value of the next megawatt will tend to decline. And that is especially for resources where the unavailability patterns are correlated across resources within that type. So for example, all PVs are all available during the day, but they're not available at night when the sun goes down, and at high penetration, this shifts the net peak and risks into the evening. And the next megawatt that you add doesn't, it too isn't generating in the evening, and it doesn't mitigate those new shortage risks. It doesn't mitigate shortage risks as much as the first did when the net peak was still in the afternoon. Average ELCC. So in concept, the average ELCC is the average of all the marginal ELCCs along the curve up to the actual level of penetration. It's estimated by simulating the group of resources, by simulating replacing the group of resources with enough perfect capacity to still meet the reliability objective. And now there's some complications with defining what group of resources to remove and how to allocate diversity benefits among them. I won't go into those, but a couple other basic observations. So average ELCC is higher because it declines more gradually as it's slowly pulled down by the marginal. And now I want to be clear that either form of accreditation can support similar reliability by adjusting the reliability requirement. Marginal ELCC gives lower accreditations, but in a system with marginal accreditation, the requirement is re-expressed to a lower value corresponding to basically what is the load plus a reserve margin when the shortage risk is greatest, and that may be the load at the time when the net peak is the greatest. In our example we've been talking about, it becomes the load in the evening. So which is better? So average ELCC may seem more fair because it pays for earlier deployments helping to meet gross peak load, and in fact all of these resources helping to meet gross peak load, which our intuition and our planning traditions might suggest is where the value is. But marginal ELCC better supports reliability and economic efficiency. So first of all, with reliability of substitutions, it provides a reliability neutral exchange rate for substitutions on the margin between the study and the auction. An average ELCC does not. So for example, if you have non-firm gas-fired capacity in New England, it may have near zero marginal value if we're talking about events in cold snaps when there's no more non-firm gas available. So it could have near zero marginal value for meeting winter needs. But it might have, say, a 30% average value. And if, now put aside that New England does not do its resource adequacy on a seasonal basis, but imagine they were doing for just winter. If you credited it that, if you credited the gas-fired at 30%, it could substitute for oil-fired capacity that it's much more reliable. Okay, and then with investment incentives. Efficiency is maximized if all resources are always compensated for the marginal value they provide by generating at the times when risk is greatest. And availability at other times has little value, even if we value reliability equally in all periods. And this is clear that you have to reward the marginal value from economic theory and from optimization theory. And of course, the need to reward all resources at the marginal value is most obvious when you think about retirement. You should retire a resource when you're no longer adding enough value at the margin. And I'd also say that, lastly, that marginal ELCC is no less fair than energy-only markets, or than any market, or any welfare maximizing system. Again, compare to the energy-only market ideal that we've always used as a benchmark for designing capacity markets. Energy-only markets pays high prices only when there's scarcity, not when there's not. So for example, if ERCOT gets 20,000 megawatts of photovoltaics, it will hollow out the energy price in the afternoon during the gross peak and will not get paid very much for that. That's true of the entire fleet, even the first megawatt of PV that was added, although that once there's a lot of PV, obviously when there's not very much PV and there's just a little bit generating in the afternoon, the prices are highest, then it gets paid a lot then, but not in the future where it's become the reality that there's lots of PV, and that's because the marginal cost of developing PV has come way down. Another analogy, we don't pay, why we don't pay based on what's happening at the gross peak, we don't pay for inertia or other services that come for free. And then just a couple closing thoughts, because marginal versus average, we like to talk about it because it's this interesting conceptual argument, but it's not the only question to address. So even if we do all agree, or some of us, that it should be marginal ELCC, you can't just do that for solar and wind. It has to apply, you have to apply the concept to all resources. Otherwise, we'll fail to have a reliability neutral exchange rate that we need for both reliability and efficient investment. And by the way, just to be clear, there is a lot of, like in my example a moment ago about the gas-fired resources, or this great paper that Kevin published about a month ago, showing that the ELCC, he was looking at average, but even that got a lot lower for thermal resources that we've often thought of as highly valuable, once you consider their correlated outages. So when developing comparable marginal accreditation for all resources, you do have to recognize that the nature of the unavailabilities and their correlations to shortages vary by resource, and some are more weather driven, some are driven by weather and management factors like winterization, fuel management. You really need the right combination of modeling and empiricism to fairly address every type of resource.
All right, thank you, Sam. Thank you, Kevin. Really appreciate the level setting of the stage. We obviously all know which side you folks are on, and so hopefully we can illustrate these positions further through Q&A. So I have some written down. We'll switch over to the Slido Q&A here shortly. But I think you both hit an important topic, and this is something that in the ESIG Redefining Resource Adequacy Task Force we've been talking a lot about as well. And getting a reliable system is the easy part. Getting it efficiently is the challenge. And so what I view resource accreditation is getting efficient reliability. And so I think some people delineate this idea of average versus marginal debate as a trade-off between, one is accurately measuring the total system reliability that resources bring. The other is prioritizing economic efficiency and trying to provide an accurate price signal. So can you talk a little bit more about which process favors economic efficiency or accurately prices the benefit that it brings? And I think I want to start this with Kevin, because Kevin, you threw a little bit of a curveball in your dynamic ELCC approach of doing your evaluation on average and then pricing based on marginal. So let's talk a little bit more about this trade-off between measuring system reliability accurately versus sending appropriate price signals. And I'll start that with Kevin, and then we'll switch it over to Sam.
Yeah, thanks, Derek. And I do want to be clear, because in some of the documentation, there's this idea that average accreditation is going to continue to pay resources after we've fully exhausted their capacity contribution. So any framework should not select any further resources once the marginal ELCC of that resource drops to 0. No more resources should get selected. I think this does require avoiding this ex ante approach where we determine the ELCC in advance and then whatever comes in is going to get paid that amount. We have to avoid that ultimately. And I think we're going to discuss that in more detail. But ultimately with my proposal, every resource gets selected on the margin. What I'm trying to recognize is that there is a sequential nature to this. You don't select all the resources on the margin where supply equals demand. You select the first resource with its marginal ELCC. Then you select the next resource with its marginal ELCC and the next resource. And so as the ELCC declines, the effective cost is going to go up. So a resource that's got the same bid price as its ELCC declines, the cost goes up. So we are effectively sorting those resources as we step through the sequential nature of this capacity auction clearing so that every resource, its true contribution to reliability is measured on an economic, correct economic framework.
Great. Thank you. And Sam, over to you in terms of this prioritization of getting the total reliability right versus pricing signals. Can you talk a little bit more about that perceived trade-off, even if it's not actually a trade-off?
Yeah, there are a lot of, you can do accreditation fairly badly and still probably have reliability as long as you increase your reliability requirement to account for however you're doing accreditation. The question here is about pricing signals. It is about how to, crediting is like paying for stuff, how to pay for stuff in such a way that gets an efficient outcome. And I think Kevin and I agree that the only way to do that is to respect marginal values. I think we also agree that, and this is a longer discussion, the idea of a dynamic clearing is worth thinking about more, particularly for cases where most of the fleet is fairly static. It doesn't change from one year to the next all that much, and we know kind of where we are on that curve. But if that curve is really steep and we have a lot of uncertainty where we'll be on that curve, I kind of like the idea to explore Kevin's idea of dynamic clearing. But where Kevin's idea, I think, has a bit of a problem is this idea that, in effect, he is saying you can, and Kevin, tell me if I've got this wrong, but I think you're saying that we can clear as if you're paying marginal, but then you're actually going to pay everybody the average, and that does not work because it creates an incentive compatibility problem. So if you tell people, yeah, we're going to clear you, you just give us your bids and then we'll clear you, to optimally, like Kevin is saying, but then we're going to pay you average. I think you can do what Kevin is saying, but then you ultimately have to pay everybody based on marginal values. If you instead are paying them the average value, they'll change their bid. And that is not a desirable system. It is flawed in that, it means, so for example, a resource that has a prospect of getting paid this much higher average value, they will lower their bid to try to fool it. And you'll get the same dispatch order as if you were clearing on average values. Now, maybe there's a way around that with, I can't even call it market power mitigation, bid mitigation. We definitely don't want a system that depends on the market monitor mitigating everybody's bid, not just people's bids who have market power, but even competitive players, because they have an incentive compatibility problem and they're going to bid as if they're going to get paid average.
Kevin, can you maybe jump in and respond to that? This idea of, are you talking about clearing the auction based on the marginal and then paying on average, or how do you think we should overcome Sam's concern there?
Yeah, so ultimately, in the context of a vertically integrated utility, their framework is different. So we're trying to kind of compare apples and oranges here. But for a vertically integrated utility, obviously, they get this vintage marginal approach. So I'm going to buy the first resource with the highest ELCC. I'm going to pay that resource that price. Then I buy the next resource. As the ELCC goes down, I'm having to pay those particular resources a different price. And ultimately, for those clients, they can use that vintage marginal. Ultimately, that would be somewhat ideal. In a capacity auction, though, everybody has to be treated the same. And since every resource is dispatched equitably, so if I have I've got 10 gigawatts of 4-hour batteries, one could be dispatched at noon today, one could be dispatched at 8 o'clock tomorrow afternoon. It all just depends kind of the dispatch order, and it's going to change fairly. So ultimately, every one of those resources is going to fit into the dispatch stack such that they really do provide the average value. There's no distinction. That last resource that gets selected, he isn't the last resource that gets dispatched or the first resource that gets dispatched. So ultimately, his actual contribution is the average ELCC. I do think there's an aspect that I didn't quite communicate well with the storage example. So we recognize that the decline of ELCCs is not a straight line always. So for solar, maybe it looks relatively straight to the marginal ELCC declines, and so you can apply this principle. For storage, where we have these disconnects, where I have to move from daily charging to weekly charging from the weekend to the weekday, there's no way to select 20 gigawatts of resources that are half the price and have those serve a significant 50% of the net load of the system and still pay them the amount that they're supply or that they need, that they're bidding in. These are not existing resources. So if I got 20 gigawatts of potential new resources that need to get paid $100 a kilowatt year, it makes sense for us to pay them at least that much. So they clear first, and then we go to the longer duration that's bidding at a higher price. They suppress that marginal ELCC of those 8-hour batteries such that now the accreditation says they're basically worthless. They're not going to get paid nearly their bid price. And so you have to incorporate the sequential nature in the clearing in order to have the right exchange. Sam talks about the reliability and neutral exchange rate, and I agree with that. That's on the margin where supply equals demand. So for that resource selection, we should have a mechanism that says, hey, if I'm trying to decide between a solar resource that has a marginal ELCC of 20% and an oil resource, I have to adjust for that. So I'm going to divide the bid price of the solar by 20% to get the effective bid price. Oil resource, I'm going to compare that on the margin. Once I select that resource, now that gets rolled back into the portfolio ELCC. So the entire solar portfolio, now if I selected that solar resource, the entire portfolio ELCC is going to drop. And there are some challenges with this. And this is part of why I say that we need to spend more time working through the challenges, because I do believe ultimately that there is a mechanism that doesn't violate any economic principles, but still allows you to pay for resources efficiently.
So I want to boil this up. I am concerned. I think, Kevin, you said this right. I think we have to expect that everybody on the line today has at least a tertiary experience with capacity accreditation. We've probably gone past that level of understanding with many of the folks. I'm on the edge of my seat trying to figure out the nuances between what you all are saying. I want to take it back one level first and say, why are we talking about this? What resources are going to be most affected by this average versus marginal? Who is, what resources are most concerned about whether the ISO or the utility selects average or marginal? And so, Sam, maybe do you want to start with that and kind of why are we talking about this? Who's most affected by this decision and why?
Yeah, the ones who have, I would say the ones who have the fastest declining marginal ELCC curves are most affected. And by the way, all their competitors are affected too, right? Because of how you treat them. So, and I will tell you, by the way, Kevin and I disagree on these economic points. I will tell you, by far, the best enterprise modeling this stuff, analyzing the risks, answering questions like you just asked, by far, is Kevin, that has actually really pushed the envelope on how to do that well, how to understand how different types of resources and their availability relate to weather conditions, how to simulate all those things in a coherent way. And I have learned so much from Kevin actually more from Kevin on these topics than from anybody. But we do disagree on these economic points. And I have to come back to one thing. What Kevin is proposing departs from what an energy-only market does. We have always treated that as the ideal. There's a reason. This is a hokey engineering idea about how to set something else up. The energy-only market, there are reasons we're not doing it, but it gets the placement of value in the right places. We've always known that. If we're departing from that, you have to be suspicious. And one other point I have to make, it's not true that average is the right thing for a vertically integrated utility, and that's actually the right thing paying them. Let me just simplify it, not even talk about power plants. You're thinking of building a factory that makes widgets for 20 years. In order to make the right investment decision, you need to know that every year you're going to be selling widgets, even in year 10, 15, and 20. You will be paid at that time the marginal value of a widget at that time. And not some locking in some price for today. What goes wrong if you do something else? I mean, so we're in a world where the marginal cost, long-run marginal cost of resources is declining. If you gave somebody legacy marginal or something, they'll make bad decisions today and overinvest today because they think they'll be counted so much for providing something in 5 years that somebody else can do very cheaply.
But now there is a difference. I think when we talk about an energy only market, which is paying the margin at any given point in time, like there is a reason we have introduced a planning construct, a forward capacity market that pays for reliability outside of the real-time spot prices. We can argue, I don't want to get into that argument of why we have.
And I'm not either, but I will tell you that everybody, I've worked on designing, refining capacity markets all over the world. We always treat an energy-only market as the ideal. There are reasons we don't do an energy-only market because we want to ensure a higher level of reliability and pay more without having super high shortage prices. There are other reasons too that we sort of learned in what happened in ERCOT a little over a year ago. But those are besides the point.
Yeah, I guess, so we've now, with this capacity accreditation, we're moving to the planning framework. We're moving to this capacity framework. So Kevin, what do you have to say about kind of that discrepancy of why we might want to go to an average approach in a planning framework as opposed to real-time operations?
Yeah, if I can keep my thoughts straight, I'd like to respond to Sam's comment really quickly about the energy market ideal. Ultimately, when I started my career 25 years ago working at Southern Company, we were exposed to those high energy prices in the summers of 99 and 2000, paying $3,000, $5,000 a megawatt hour. The next summer, we decided to purchase capacity on the marketplace, and we had a mild summer. After that summer, we couldn't go back and then say, hey, I don't want to pay for that capacity anymore. I didn't really need it in those time periods. And ultimately, I think that's a representation of what we're trying to do with this framework, because the capacity auction really is, it's sequential in nature. We're buying the first megawatt that we need, the next megawatt that we need, and we continue stepping up until supply equals demand. So we're procuring all that capacity until we get to that point. Ultimately, and I think Sam, perhaps I haven't explained myself clearly enough, but ultimately we believe in the same economic principles. There is no need to lock in a price. A resource that gets built today should not get guaranteed any type of bid price. The price should be set on the margin. The last resource that clears, that where supply equals demand, that should set the price. So as battery prices decline, we go from say it's $100 a kilowatt year down to $30 a kilowatt year. There should be no guarantees for those resources that were built originally. Whatever gets bid in, the lowest cost resource, the first one that gets selected is going to get the highest ELCC, so the lowest cost resource. And we'll continue stepping up. We'll step down that marginal ELCC curve. And so that existing resource who has long run costs or continued costs of operation that exceed the new resources will retire. We'll have to retire. That economic principle should be in place. The only issue is this recognition of the sequential nature of the capacity auction clearing, that if I don't recognize that I bought a resource for $100 a kilowatt year, and that's the first resource that made it into the auction, And then the last resource that clears is at $200 a kilowatt year, but it's got a much longer duration. That shouldn't obviate the benefit that that first resource that I purchased brought in. It makes sense to buy that $100 a kilowatt resource, even though it's got shorter duration, because we don't need everything to be 100 hours of duration. We need 20 gigawatts of capacity that is short duration.
And I think I want to talk about, you're introducing a portfolio concept and a portfolio effect. I think when the average versus marginal debate first came up, the idea was there's these synergistic resources that go together, right? If the solar ELCC drops to zero pretty quickly, but as soon as you bring on storage, this solar all of a sudden starts to have value because it's providing energy that the storage can then shift. And the question becomes, well, who gets that value, right? Who gets paid for that provision? And likewise, if you just add a bunch of solar to the system, but you add no energy to charge it, the storage value is going to zero. And then when you add energy, all of a sudden that brings a lot of ELCC to the system. So can you talk a little bit about these synergistic portfolios and what is the best way to incorporate those effects? So I'll start this one with Kevin and then maybe throw it over to Sam to mix up the order here.
Yeah, thanks, Derek. So with the dynamic clearing approach that I proposed, you fully embed that synergy within the calculation. So the first resource that comes on is going to get his contribution. The next resource gets his contribution. As we step that up, you're going to have those synergies appear in that marginal ELCC curve. This is ultimately a lot like the proposal that E3 has put forward with the Delta method, where we start with first in, we measure last in ELCCs, and then there's a method for allocating between those resource classes. Ultimately, this dynamic clearing is going to assign the correct synergies across all those resource classes. So as we build up and it makes sense to add a little bit more solar here, add a little bit more storage here, go back and add some more solar there, add some more storage here. Each of those steps is going to get that marginal ELCC, and the integration of all of that gets us back to the average ELCC ultimately for that entire portfolio.
Thanks, Kevin. Sam, do you have anything else to add there?
Yeah, so first of all, those diversity benefits are really important. Anytime when you're talking about marginal at any point for any fleet that you have or that you're modeling, it's a very straightforward concept. And, the marginal value of any resource does reflect, all the other resources in the fleet being there, and it does depend on those. See, it's a very straightforward concept with marginal. It gets a little trickier with average because you're talking about this whole group of resources and how do you allocate the diversity benefits. And there are some, interesting ways to do that, but there's no perfect way to do that. But I think, first of all, I want to comment on a couple things. Kevin, I like the concept, the possibility of that dynamic clearing. I don't know, that's worth exploring more, whether that would always converge and whether, that would actually work. I think one of the places where we still really disagree, though, is that you can pay people at the average and hope to get the results that are like marginal. Another thing is just a basic flaw in the concept. Any market, what people get paid has to do with the intersection of supply and demand, and everybody gets paid the market price. That reflects the intersection of supply and demand. This average ELCC thing is mixing up that price by trying to average in something for a different world that has a different fleet that doesn't exist anymore, taking away some of the resources and averaging what the price would be at that point with, price or marginal value at that point with what it is now and paying that. That world doesn't exist anymore. And there's another related observation too. Because I think some people have the impression that marginal ELCC, it's somehow taking advantage of people, or maybe taking advantage that they're already built and maybe there's sunk costs. That's not true. Marginal ELCC, you'd also expect in a system like that, prices to converge at the long run marginal cost. That includes capital and fixed costs. But, the thing is, especially for something like solar or batteries, where the cost has been coming down, we're so far along the curve because we're where we should be for where the long run marginal cost is now. Now, you could get rid of all the existing resources, all the existing solar and storage, say, And then you'd say, well, now would you get paid more? No. Because what the long run marginal cost is of those now, you would add back a whole lot and get back to exactly the place you are with the current fleet. My point is, there's nothing relevant about the economics of some imagined other fleet where you don't have, can't have, whatever, the amount of resources that you have now. And it really mixes up price signals if you try to average in at all the marginal value from that scenario with where we actually are in terms of fleet, in terms of actual marginal costs.
Thank you both. You brought up some concern, Sam, that some folks are pitting this of not being fairly treating some resources versus others. One of my concerns in the average versus marginal is a potential to over procure capacity, right? If we're using marginal and we assign very little credit to the last megawatt going in and everybody gets that capacity credit, then when we stack up all the pieces, do we end up over procuring? And Sam, to your credit, in your first slides, you said as long as you adjust the reserve margin requirement to total capacity, you're okay there. Do you think folks are doing that? Can you talk a little bit more about the process that you would have to go through to make sure that we're not over procuring capacity by stacking up these incremental pieces? Because that's something I fear that you're right. You pointed it out right away. I give you credit for that. Not everybody knows that. Not everybody recognizes that, hey, in the future, our reserve margin requirement might actually be below our peak load, right? And that might already be happening in some places. So can you talk a little bit about that need to reset the reserve margin requirement?
Sure, yeah. Yeah, I don't think it'll go below peak load. I think it'll go below where we're used to, a gross peak load plus the kind of reserve margins we're used to. But anyway, this is not actually a controversial part. So when MISO recently changed its accreditation of thermal units to look back at the last 3 years and look how they performed in tight periods, and that is a sort of marginalish concept. It doesn't put enough weight on the most shortage risk hours. So it's not, resources that tend to do badly when things in challenging conditions, they don't get dinged enough, but it still gave them a lower accredit. It would give them a lower accreditation than under the old system that just treated outages as uncorrelated, as just basically the capacity minus the E4D. So they knew, oh, well, if we're changing accreditation, we have to change the requirement. I mean, the requirement is just a description of the modeled fleet. How much capacity do you need to meet your requirement? You need to express that in the same terms that you're going to do accreditation. Otherwise, you have no hope of having a match up to what you're trying to do. I mean, so as soon as you get into this, you realize you have to adjust the requirement corresponding to to be consistent with how you'll do accreditation.
Thanks, Sam. I appreciate you pointing that out, making that clear. Again, I know you understand it. I think some others missed that part of the discussion. So, Kevin, anything else to add there? Is average, is there a benefit there if we use average, or is it just, as long as you account for it in either way, you're okay?
Yeah, I agree with Sam. This is not a controversial topic. Ultimately, I think this is the issue of the ex ante approach to determination of the ELCC. So maybe jumping the gun in terms of addressing that particular point, but I feel like it needs to be said here in this context, is that the risk really is on either side. It could be that we over procure or that we under procure. So let's take the example where we have a 10 gigawatt natural gas fleet that is assumed to be a 0% ELCC resource because it doesn't have enough firm gas. We think that it can actually provide 8 gigawatts of capacity. So we set the requirement based on that resource class being present, providing 8 gigawatts of reliability value. And yet, if it doesn't show up in the capacity auction, it decides to retire rather than participate because it's going to get zero value. Now we set the requirements really low because we use that 0% ELCC for a 10 gigawatt fleet. Now we're going to clear to that amount. And if we clear to that amount, we're going to be very short of our reliability needs if those resources have retired. So there's reliability risk, and that's true for both marginal and average. So I'm not trying to make that point just for marginal. Ultimately, if there's this ex ante determination of the ELCC that's going to get applied, you have that risk. It has to be dynamic. You have to publish a curve, and then based on how much capacity clears, where you fall on that curve to determine what the actual ELCC that's going to get applied for every resource class.
Yeah, and just to be clear, I want to make sure there are things that you both agree on, and we should highlight those. I think those are important as well. So maybe let's talk about that ex ante challenge. And for those on the call that might not be familiar with that, the idea is we're looking out in the future at what the resource mix will be and trying to determine if that's reliable and what all the credits should be in that future resource mix. We don't know exactly what that's going to look like, and it fundamentally depends on what accreditation resources get. So Kevin, you just touched on it, but how do we get across, how do we overcome that circularity challenge where the accreditation we give a resource really depends on who shows up, and who shows up depends on the accreditation of that resource? It's a chicken and egg problem. So Sam, do you have anything to add to what Kevin talked about with this ex ante challenge?
Yeah, so first of all, I just want to be clear that I think Kevin's identified a really interesting issue. Now, in most cases, I don't think it's a concern. So see, what he's talking about is basically if the ELCC curve is changing very rapidly and you are not actually sure how much will clear, you don't know what value to set. And if you set it, if you think, oh, they'll all come, they'll all be there, and you set it really low, but you were wrong, then they don't come, whoops. Now the value was actually high and you really missed them and you're not even reliable. And Kevin and I agree on that. But just to be clear, there are some special cases where that's probably the case. I think if New England were to do a winter capacity market, it might find something like that with the gas-fired fleet. I mean, again, when you do the modeling, you really do the modeling. It depends on how fast does the ELCC curve fall. I think in most cases, though, it's not the case. The fleet does not, most of what's built will be there. You don't have tons of uncertainty how much capacity you'll have and where you'll be on the ELCC curve. There's way more uncertainty that comes from just even the modeling analysis that you do and not anything else that goes into your accreditation. You can set the ELCCs ex ante in most cases and without it being too inaccurate, because what actually clears is a little different from what you assume. I think there are just some special cases like the gas in New England where I think it's actually would be really interesting to explore whether Kevin's idea of dynamic clearing would work. Except you still have to pay them, and the dynamic clearing would help because it would be within the auction. You make sure you clear the right amount and you didn't guess wrong. But if that even works to do that. But the one place we differ again is, but you must pay them the marginal value. Otherwise, they'll mess up their bids in a way that gets you back to the merit order as if you've done average ELCC.
Kevin, thank you, Sam. Kevin, anything else you wanted to add on that topic? Or?
Yeah, I just think some of the changes that are coming in the marketplace because of this particular debate haven't been fully appreciated. I think that this average versus marginal issue is going to affect behavior of market participants as well. I don't expect to have as many price-taking bids as we've seen historically. So I think there has to be a recognition that, hey, a number of these resources are going to start bidding close to their true cost structure, and they may not end up clearing in the market because of that. So you may not know exactly what the portfolio looks like going forward. Also, I mean, with batteries and storage, modular designs can easily be added or subtracted. I mean, I do think that changes the kind of the fundamental nature of what we can expect or rely on from year to year. So I do think that there is significant value in doing this dynamic clearing for every capacity auction, where we sequentially clear every resource at its marginal ELCC and then attribute that entire class at the average, credit at the average.
Thank you. I want to go back to another thing that I think you both agree on, but really, again, use it as a way to highlight its importance, because I think I'm hearing a lot more about this in the industry. Kevin, you just, again, put out a great paper on this. This idea around accreditation for all, and do we need to accredit all resources? Does it need to be done in a consistent way across resources. And so when I talk about all resources, typically most places today are accrediting wind and solar on ELCC. Places have started to do this for storage, particularly if there's a lot of storage coming in. Just now we're talking about accrediting thermal resources based on ELCC. So can we talk a little bit about, do we need to do this for all resources on the system? Is it computationally tractable to do it for all resources? And yeah, Kevin, Sam mentioned your paper on it. So can you maybe talk about this first and then we'll go over to Sam?
Yeah. So this is certainly a topic that we've spent a lot of time kind of exploring in the recent past. Historically, there's been this proxy idea that E4D is a good proxy for the reliability contribution of conventional generators. In the same way that for wind and solar resources, the average output during summer afternoon hours is a good proxy for its reliability contribution. Ultimately, recognizing the very stringent nature of a 1 in 10 standard, we need to know the contribution to a 1 in 10 level of reliability. So it doesn't really matter if you're meeting a 95% availability or a 5% E4D throughout the course of the year. You really need to know what happens during those really extreme periods of system stress. So ultimately, every resource should get assessed against that same standard. So we believe we've done calculations of the thermal impact that a resource portfolio that has a 95% accreditation under this UCAP framework, which says 1 minus E4D. So 5% E4D says, hey, I'm going to give all those resources 95% credit. Ultimately, their contribution to reliability may really only be 90%. And I think it makes sense to reflect that in the accreditation. And if we do that on the margin, that impact could actually be larger, especially for units that are large or things like these correlated fuel supply risks or other things that there are impacts that are going to have outsized effect. But ultimately, I mean, that's every resource class. It's not just thermal. It is the battery, it's the solar, the storage, or battery, solar, wind, every resource class. Ultimately, if we're treating those correctly, then we can have a static reserve margin that just reflects the load variability, maybe ancillary services that you carry during reliability events. And then all of the rest of the reliability risk is rolled up into that ELCC calculation. So for all those resource classes, their ELCC will be a little bit lower, and the PRM, the planning reserve margin, will be a little bit lower. But ultimately, we've fully, fairly accredited all resource classes against the same standard.
Great, thank you. And Sam, anything else to add?
Well, yeah, so first of all, I want to highlight the importance, same standard, because I think we're in danger of not doing that. And you know, if we a lot of us have been sort of attracted by the prospect of modeling the limitations of wind and solar because it's very amenable to getting data and modeling on these problematic correlations. You know, the wind dies for everybody at the same time when load's fairly high, or sun goes down at the same time, and we can model that. We can model a lot of different weather years and how different weather, you have whatever wind, solar, and load correspond to that. And so we've sort of gone to where the light is, you know, and sort of forgotten. It's harder to do that. The thermal units also have this problem. And I'll just remind you, the biggest failure of electricity supply North America has ever seen was in ERCOT last year. And it was because of, you know, very cold weather, primarily affecting the gas fleet, both because of not enough fuel supply and also winterization. And we've had other events when there's lots of thermal capacity on maintenance. So that has been a, you know, sorry, I just got distracted by one of these images on here on my screen with somebody moving around a lot. But anyway, so it's a major issue that their thermals also have this, but it's harder. And I really will say, Kevin's paper a month ago was one of the most important contributions to resource accreditation I've seen in years, because it shows that the thermals do have this problem too. They tend to all go out at the same time and drive the shortages. So that is, if we ignore that, why is it harder though? Because it's not just a function of the weather. We know that the solar won't run when the sun at night. But you know, how does the thermal fleet do in cold weather? Nobody predicted what would happen accurately going into this ERCOT event. How well winterized are they? What fuel arrangements do they have? You know, these kinds of things. And then the data is fairly sparse on how they've, you know, if you look back a few years, you probably won't find one of these challenging events, which is exactly what we're trying to plan against. So how do you even get the data into your model about how they perform in these events? And by the way, I will say again, Kevin's done more than anybody to address that problem, to analyze the data and to figure out how to model it. Ultimately, you have to capture it from some combination of modeling it, but again, you have to populate the model with the right correlation factors and how their outages relate to each other and the weather. Or at least do some sort of historical approach. A historical approach though that puts proper weight on where the risk is. So it would have to look over, and that's tricky because you could look over a very long period and put most of the weight on just the most extreme events. Of course, when you look over a very long period, you wonder how applicable is that, you know, long history to resources as they're operating now in their current health, especially on an individual resource level, given their current, you know, status of the resource, how they're managing their fuel now. So this is a tricky problem. We're not going to get it perfect. But this is what we have to try to do, and I know we'll get it wrong if we just go and do ELCC for wind and solar, and we don't attempt to do the same thing for the thermal units. I mean, and of course all the resource types.
Yeah, I really appreciate that. There's two things that came out of both Kevin and Sam's answers there. You know, one is I think we're converging on this need to accredit all resources in a fair and consistent manner. I think that is something we can all agree on. I think that's really important. That needs to be echoed kind of throughout the industry, because otherwise we're missing risk, right? And what we're trying to do is make sure we're properly evaluating and properly accrediting resources based on when the risk is, where the risk is, how long the risk occurs for. And so we need to get that right. The second thing that came out of this is the modeling is getting a lot harder, right? So now it's not just time synchronized wind, solar load, which in and of itself is very challenging, but now we're bringing in other weather variables. For thermal outages, as you said, Sam, the data is much more sparse, and you know, you have to start looking across longer time horizons. My fear on all of this, whether we go average or marginal, is we are putting too much stock in our simulations, too much stock in our forecast of where risk is, and we're potentially missing risk on the system. So I want to take a step back and really just talk about how computationally intensive this process is, how it's getting more computationally intensive, and what we can do about it. Do we need to go down to every individual resource, not just resource class, but any individual resource we need to think about in a unique manner, because maybe one thermal resource has backup fuel capability, or maybe one resource has winterized, or a wind resource in one area of the state might have a very different profile to a wind resource in another. So how granular do we have to go with the ELCC? How tough is this accreditation process getting? And is it computationally fair? And I'll start with Kevin. You're doing these studies across the country. Where do you see the future of this study work? Is it computationally feasible to get to the accuracy that we need?
Yep. So we've been doing these types of studies. I was telling somebody today that I was running ELCC studies before some of my employees were born, 25 years ago or so. And we've wrestled with these questions for a long time. It's like, how tractable is this ultimately? We do feel like we made a lot of progress in those 25 years, and that we do have a good sense ultimately to identify what the total need is. I think the real challenge is in fair and equitable treatment to all resource classes. So I can run simulations, I can pick up these correlated outage risks. Even though the sample size of the events is small, we can model the fuel supply system, we can model correlations between generator classes, we can model kind of the effects of weatherization and so forth. And so we can identify the total kind of need for the system to meet the 1 day in 10 level of reliability. I think the bigger challenge is determining this allocation. So to determine the allocation, it requires a separate simulation for every resource that you're going to measure. So if we do get down to the individual resource level, you have to run lots of individual simulations to know the impact of each individual resource, because every resource ultimately affects the commitment and dispatch pattern of other resources. So I can't just take a snapshot of the system at 1 in 10 and say, well, what was every resource's contribution? Ultimately, if that resource is not there, then other resources may have needed to fill in, and their dispatch patterns may change and so forth. So ultimately, to understand that those interactions, I do think it requires simulating in steps, a sequential nature, build up the system with the cheapest resource and kind of solve for the solution that way. It does take a while to run.
Thanks, Kevin. And Sam, anything on this idea? Is the problem just getting too intractable, too challenging, or do we have a solution for that?
It's a mistake to say it's too computationally intensive. That's sort of sloppy. I think it is computationally, it is challenging. Let me just point out that most of these models are not even capturing the risks. So for example, are they even showing these winter risks when you have huge correlated outages? They're generally not. A lot of other things too, like they over-optimize maintenance of resources and, but the biggest thing is how well are we populating the data in the model about resource variability in challenging conditions? We do that easily for wind and solar. It's a pretty simple function of the ambient conditions, and we have data on the ambient conditions. But the challenge is, can you even model the risks well? Okay, so that's the first thing. Second of all, if you do marginal, and this is sort of a long discussion, but you don't need to do as many simulations to get, to do the studies. You don't have to do a different simulation for every resource. But I think generally the general approach that I think makes sense is to do probably use a model to describe for each class to address things, to capture things like, how does wind do given its patterns relative to everything else that's going on in the fleet and load? How much does it matter to have 1 day of fuel storage versus 10 or battery storage of different durations when you look at a broad distribution of events that these simulations can capture, especially if you use the kind that Kevin does that's based on draws of different weather patterns. But then you also need a resource specific factor, a little like PJM's last factor in what they're doing, that theirs looks at, and I put aside that unfortunately it's doing average ELCC, but it's looking at the top, let's just call it the top 200 hours over the last 10 years that are tightest, whenever those occurred for each individual resource. And even for the ones that they don't have data, we actually do have meteorological data and we can generate it pretty well using what they call putative generation. But for each individual resource, you see how it does relative to the class based on its own performance and own granular data. So that I think it's tractable. It's not too computational intensive, too many runs. This isn't that, we're talking about one study a year, basically. You can do it. That's not too many runs. The question is, how good is your data that you're populating the model? How well have you addressed things like the correlations across all different resources? You get it exactly right if you do it the way Kevin tends to do it, which is modeling, many different years of weather patterns and what is the wind, solar, and load and everything that flows from that, and also doing a good job of modeling storage and everything. So that is, you can do it. It's just, there's another challenge here, which is there's a lot of money on this, as you said right at the beginning, and it depends a lot on, particularly if using more on the modeling side compared to the measurement side that MISO went towards with the thermals. There's just people will care. We're going to argue about this stuff for a long time.
Yeah, there's a lot of money on the line. I want to ask one more question, then open up to the Q&A. Sam, you brought this up of, one, the models are never going to perfectly capture risk. We can get better at it, but it's never going to perfectly get it. And there's a potential disconnect between what we're simulating as risk and then whether or not a resource actually shows up when we need it. So we talk a little bit, and we're going to make this somewhat short so we can get to the Q&A. We talk a little bit about how we can balance future simulated accreditation versus retrospective performance, like whether the resource that we assign a certain value in our simulations, whether it shows up when we need to, regardless of when that risk period occurs. Kevin, can you talk a little bit about that first, and then we'll throw it over to Sam?
Yeah, I'll make this real brief so that we can get to the Q&A. I do think that it's important that you have performance incentives, right, to make sure that you are performing up to what you're getting paid for. Ultimately, I do think in that context, you can use E4D as a proxy, but it needs to reflect this adjustment that we recognize that its ELCC is probably going to be less than would be implied by the E4D. So if a generator with a 5% E4D versus a generator with a 10% E4D, they would both have an adjustment to reflect that fact. So their performance is ultimately going to affect. We run the simulations and we say a generator with a 5% E4D is really contributing 90% to system reliability. So if that generator performs at an E4D of 5%, and he's going to get paid, or there's going to be some performance adjustment to his credit to recognize that 10% adjustment.
And Sam, anything else on that? A performance of how we can better link operations and future planning?
No, I think there has to be at least a factor in there that takes into account a resource's specific adjustment performance during tight periods. But I also think that hopefully this is in the context of energy and ancillary service markets that are also recognized performance.
All right, thank you both. Let's go over to the Slido, and we've got about 12 minutes left here. So the first one, I'm just going to look at how we voted. How much difference, if any, should the timeline of the capacity auction matter for our average versus marginal? I think we touched on this when we talked about this ex-ante challenge. PJM is a 3-year forward, so is ISO New England, NISO is 1 year. How much does that timeline matter for these auctions? Kevin?
Yeah, so I mean, this ultimately may weigh into Sam's comment about we kind of know what the resources are going to be next year if we're looking 1 year ahead. If we have dialed in what those resources are, then ultimately you may be closer, and the ex-ante question may not be as critical. I still think that retirement decisions can be made in the very short term. So ultimately, regardless of the time frame of the auction, that it's important to do this dynamic recognition of each resource's contribution. I'll leave it at that.
And Sam?
Yeah, I think that's a good answer. Yeah, any place where the ELCC curve is declining very steeply and you're not exactly sure where the fleet's going to be on that. And yes, they could retire or take a holiday or sell to another ISO and surprise you. And that could, even on a pretty short time frame. So where that's the case, I think we ought to explore Kevin's dynamic clearing idea, but then pay the marginal.
All right, and I wish this next question from Alex Rutovich, I wish I got to it right after my last question before switching over to Slido, and the next one maybe goes with that. Can we just do this with proper scarcity pricing? If the resource gets paid for reliability via scarcity pricing in real time, would there still be a need for accreditation? Sam, you want to hit that one?
Yeah, thanks. This is exactly the question that ERCOT is grappling with right now. And remember, this is coming out of a, Winter Storm Uri, when they had, the theory had been, they got the scarcity pricing really high. Everybody has the incentive to make sure they're going to be available when shortages occur. And it was really disappointing. It was tragic, but it was also from a sort of market design standpoint, it was disappointing to realize that actually wasn't enough. And so we actually, there are two issues. One is so the prospect of shortage pricing, first of all, it'll lead to a market equilibrium and Kevin and I have worked on this plenty of times together analyze what that is. It may not be providing the 1 in 10 that you might want. So you might want even more reliability than that. But you especially might want more assurance and be able to see an accredited fleet that you are confident is going to do better than that fleet did, say, in Uri. So you might want to get into things like, show me your backup fuel, show me your winterization to get accredited. These are the kinds of questions they'll be grappling with. Just to be clear, the other capacity markets are not looking very closely at those conditions for getting accredited. But you could, in concept, the idea is, look, we want more reliability than the energy-only market will provide, and and you have to get shortage pricing up really high to get towards something like 1 in 10. And we might want to be have some way of looking at the whole fleet and saying, we're comfortable. This protects us against contingencies we don't want, particular degrees of coldness or risks we've identified in the winter. We're not, there's some concern that the market just was not in facing the prospect of shortage risks, did not do well enough.
Thanks. And Kevin, what do you think about the scarcity pricing? Do we even need accreditation? Can we shut down the Estrope shop and move to real-time only pricing?
Negative, Ghost Rider. So I think, so maybe Sam's recognizing that the energy market may not be quite ideal here in this case. My take is that I think we've really got to, this is where the distinctions between the capacity as a product and energy as a product show up. As Sam mentioned, we've run studies for ERCOT that show that in an energy only framework, even with the ORDC's juice, so the prices for scarcity are very high, we still expect reliability much worse than 1 day in 10 standards. So going into that reliability event, we knew that reliability was a more significant risk. Obviously the winter components, we didn't understand what all those risks were in the winter, but ultimately we recognize that in an energy only market, there's the potential that you're not going to get the same level of reliability that you might get with a capacity market. I think the other kind of aspect to this is that this energy market focus is like so hyper focused on these peak periods, where the capacity auction, because of the sequential nature, it is looking at every single hour, making sure that we've procured enough resources for every period. So my example that I poorly explained, where we know that reliability is going to be an issue in the spring during maintenance for this particular scenario. We also have to make sure that we've procured enough capacity for all those hot summer hours and the winter hours. So ultimately, I think this average accreditation that doesn't only look at those extreme events on the margin, but fully captures, fully qualifies enough capacity to meet every reliability need, I think is important.
Yeah, by the way, I just want to clarify, first of all, I wasn't saying an energy only market is better when I said the idea. I'm just saying the capacity markets have always been designed to try to replicate what energy only markets do in terms of recognizing where the value is. What an energy only market with sort of uncapped price cap and with great, really well-designed shortage pricing.
Thanks, Jim. I'm going to skip one here and kind of go to this maybe a more forward-looking question as we're getting close to the time here. Let's zoom out 10, 15 years to a system that is predominantly variable renewables, energy limited resources. Does capacity accreditation, does the ELCC framework still work in that type of system, or are we going to need something else? So Kevin, do you want to start on that?
Yeah. So when I came into this career, this industry, I was skeptical of loss of load expectation, the 1 day in 10 standard, ELCC accreditation. Ultimately, I thought there was a better framework out there. Ultimately, I've been convinced, and I consider myself maybe an evangelist for this approach, because I do believe it provides a great communication. It's consistent with the way that the market looks at reliability. It's binary in nature. We either have it or we don't. If you fail the test like ERCOT did and California did, you're going to get penalized for that. So in this context where we really increase the penetration of renewables and batteries, this framework of planning reserve margin, you can have a static planning reserve margin in that framework, because every resource is going to get accounted for consistently against a perfect resource. So the contribution of a battery, a 4-hour battery, an 8-hour battery, a 12-hour battery, a 100-hour battery are ultimately all accredited under the same framework. And so we can be confident that the intertemporal issues related to, well, what do I credit at noon versus at 8 p.m.? Ultimately, the ELCC fully captures that within that single value that it identifies. The ELCC curve, but ultimately those curves are fully reflecting all the interactions, all the intertemporal constraints of energy limited resources, all the dynamic aspects of every renewable profile, the intermittency of every profile, all the uncertainties and correlations between conventional thermal generators. Ultimately, it does provide the framework that we need to plan for these high penetration systems.
Thanks, Kevin. And Sam, how about you? Are we 10 years from now, are we going to be using the same metrics, the same process?
So first of all, I think Kevin said it really well. I think something like this, I just want to point out that we often simplify certain things when that's okay to do. And now you're talking about, in 15 years when we have a lot more, say, storage, then you probably have to make some refinements to how you're measuring or modeling storage. For example, a lot of the studies right now assume optimal management of the charge state. Well, if you're relying on a lot of storage and, because of imperfect foresight and how they put in their energy bids and how they manage their charge state, they end up not being as effective as that. Or, lots of the different ways people use hybrid resources. We will likely have to refine some of the details. But I think the principle will be the same. And I think we'll have, the other thing to keep in mind, by the way, is that we'll have more load flexibility too. The only thing that would really change this if we decided to do something completely different. What we have now, we want to have the 1 in 10, right? And we therefore need to get into all this modeling and accreditation, how to do it. You could imagine something really quite different where loads are where they're really flexible. There's lots of DR, and you could imagine even a future where resource adequacy is no longer a common good, and maybe you could let everybody choose their own reserve margin and sequentially curtail in a shortage the ones who brought the least reserve margin. We don't actually have the technology to do that, and it also has some political questions around it. But I could imagine a different future where this becomes obsolete. But mostly, I agree with what Kevin said.
Great. Thank you both. We are at the top of the hour. I want to thank both Kevin and Sam. This has been a great discussion, great debate. I liked how we started out with the details and got into average and marginal in quite a bit of detail and had a lively debate on that. I also like that we hit a lot of things that there is common ground. I think a lot of things that we as an industry really need to get right and really continue to think about. So regardless of the math on average versus marginal, there's a lot of improvements we can do to the underlying way we accredit resources, the way we think about risk. And certainly we need to do that regardless of average versus marginals. But I really appreciate your time, really appreciate your perspectives. We have a ton of questions still in the Slido and still over 200 people tuning in. So we will get responses to those or most of those posted along with the recording of this. And yeah, we really appreciate everyone's engagement, really appreciate the folks who stayed on for the full hour and a half. There's a couple webinars coming up, June 23rd, June 30th on inverter-based resources hosted by ESIG. I hope you tune into that. The fall workshop is coming up. It'll be here before you know it after the summer. October in Minneapolis, we will have at least one session on capacity accreditation and market design there. And the ESIG Redefining Resource Adequacy Task Force is specifically addressing capacity accreditation this year. So check in for more info on that. So thank you again, Kevin and Sam. This was a great discussion. Really appreciate your time. Thank you everybody else for tuning in.
Thanks, Derek. Hoping to continue the conversation.
Thanks, Derek. Thanks, Kevin. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Sam.